Hi, everyone, and welcome to IcePicks Fantasy Hockey. I'm your host, Nick Nightingale, and this is a brand new hockey podcast that's going to mainly focus on fantasy hockey, but I'm also going to go over like general hockey news and then really focus on the weekly schedules and everything else that you need in fantasy hockey that would just kind of give you the edge in your league. And the main point of this podcast is just going to be giving you like good, quick info just so you can quickly listen to this, get a good idea of what's going on for the week or your draft that's coming up, and just have an idea of, what might be a good pick, what might be a bad pick. And one other thing that I want to do in this show is I'm going to have what I call ice picks. So that might be a hot take, or that might be something that I really think, like a team that might be really good this year, or a player that's, kind of underrated and might really hit it off and get you some good points throughout the year. And it's not just going to be like, oh yeah, my ice picks pick McDavid, right? Because anybody can say that. But I might think of a guy like Thomas Harley over a guy like Miro Heiskanen. And my takes just might be, maybe they're not the best takes, but that's just a guy that I can see this year, do better. And then the consensus pick would probably be Harley over Heiskanen, but I think a lot of people might just see the name with familiarity, right? You're seeing a guy that has been a top guy in Dallas, but maybe fantasy-wise he's not as great. So that's kind of my idea with the ice picks. Yeah, and so for the first show, I just kind of want to go over teams that I think, are going to rise up and teams that are going to fall from last year. I want to go through the schedule quickly and go over the teams that have good schedules and, maybe go over the back-to-backs and teams that have lots of off nights. And then I'd like to finish with the playoffs this year. I'm going to focus on weeks 21, 22, 23 because I think most fantasy leagues are going to have playoffs like that. I don't really recommend joining a league that, runs till the end of this regular season, just because that can lead to things like, it's a 2-week or a week and a half, I guess, for the final week. And a lot of the good teams, they'll sit their players, right? So last year we had in our finals the top two teams, which was me and my brother-in-law, actually. And we had guys like Draisaitl and McKinnon and, a couple other top guys that sat out for the final 5 or 6 games. And I only ended up winning because his team, basically half the players sat because they were all being rested for the playoffs. And, when you're missing Draisaitl for 5 games in a final week and a half, you're most likely not going to win. So I'll still be going over weeks 22, 23, 24 playoffs just for any people who are in those kind of leagues. So this will still help you. I'm not going to go as in depth, but I'll still run over it and maybe give you a little bit of info. All right, so on to the first part of the show. I'm just going to go over some risers and fallers, and I think let's just go with the fallers first. I think it's a little more fun to focus on teams that just aren't going to do as good this year. Might be some hot takes here, but that's just how I feel. So, best team in the league last year, Winnipeg Jets. I just can't see them do it again. I just, even at the beginning of last year, I didn't even want to draft anybody on the team. I ended up picking Scheifele, and then I made a horrible trade mid-season to pick up Elias Pettersson from the Canucks. I'm a hometown Canucks guy, so, I'm just like typical Canucks fan thinking, he can turn it around. Anyways, he didn't. That was one of the worst trades I've ever done in fantasy hockey. But anyways, let's just forget about that. So for Winnipeg, they're the best team in hockey last year. They were number one, 116 points. And they just are a team to me that I don't like their roster right off the bat. I think Kyle Connor's amazing. Scheifele's great. But I just don't see them. They don't have a superstar besides Hellebuck. And Hellebuck's last year was a Hall of Fame season. And he could definitely replicate it. Like, he's definitely the best goalie in the league. But I think the Jets as a whole can't repeat it. I just don't see them being that great again. But I could be wrong. This could be a hot take. But I see the Jets maybe fighting for a wild card spot. I don't see them top of the league. I don't see them top of the conference. I also don't really see them the top of their division either. I could still see them making the playoffs, but I wouldn't be surprised if they're wild card 1 or 2. And then for my second faller is the Washington Capitals. And last year was Ovi's Hall of Fame year. That's the year he broke the scoring record. And I think the whole team was just playing with some swagger, right? They just wanted to get Ovi the scoring record. And I just don't see any of that happening again for them. Their goaltending, I think, is great with Logan Thompson and Charlie Lindgren. But I just don't see every other guy on the team having a career year again. And actually, by about mid-year, like a guy like McMichael, he was already starting to drop off pretty hard. I was lucky I snagged him in free agency at about week 2, and he was lighting it up for me for a bit. But then at about the midpoint of the season, I think the whole team started to kind of slow down, and luckily Ovi got the goal scoring record. But they just kind of ran on that, and I don't see it replicated again. Similar to Winnipeg, I think Washington's still a playoff team because they like their roster's great, but I don't see them being top. They might not be a wild card team, like they might actually make it in as a third seed, but I don't see best in the East, second best team in the league. And then for my third team that I think is going to drop off, I'm going with the LA Kings. And I mean, they've just had a straight downgrade in defense. They lost Gavrikov, and I mean, Doughty is great, but he's just going to be their only guy. He's the only guy worthwhile to pick up on that team defense-wise, right? And their goaltending, Darcy Kemper, he had an unreal year. I still think he'll have a good year. The Kings they play such a defensive structure that you're kind of guaranteeing they're going to be a half-decent team, but I wouldn't be surprised if they don't make the playoffs. And I think a guy like Kempe is definitely worth a pickup, but I'd probably pass on almost everybody else. And I think the Pacific is kind of up in the air right now. I mean, you got Vegas and Edmonton for sure. And then after that is kind of a crapshoot, right? So a team like Vancouver, they could rise or they could drop off again. Who knows, right? Even a team like Anaheim. I think Anaheim has a pretty good schedule this year, not just fantasy-wise, but also just in the NHL regular season. And they could be a team that's on the up and coming too, right? They got young guys like Leo Carlson and stuff, right? So I wouldn't be surprised if a team like LA drops out of the playoffs and a young core like that, like Anaheim, for example, pops up in and takes over that wild card spot from them. So that's my 3 fallers, Winnipeg, Washington, and LA. And now we're going to move on to teams that are going to be risers to me and teams that probably shouldn't even have been as bad as they were last year. But I'm going to start off with Nashville. I think that's the most consensus choice for anybody who thinks a team that should have done better after their offseason, picking up guys like Marchessault and Stamkos. And I mean, honestly, on paper, their team's good. They got solid D, solid goaltending, and they got half decent forwards. I mean, they're missing a superstar. Forsberg is close to being a superstar, and he's probably a top 15 player in the league. But they're really missing that one true guy. But that doesn't even really matter anyways because they got a guy like Yossi on the back end, and they're kind of just a complete team. And last year, I think it was too many new players at once, and the team had no, they weren't meshed together. They had no chemistry. And, I mean, losing a guy like Kiefer Sherwood, that's a pretty big one to lose, especially after he set the hit record last year in the NHL. So, I mean, they lost some grit. They lost some guys that kind of mend the locker room together. And, yeah, I can see a guy like Stamkos having a great year. I can see a guy like Marchessault having a really good year too. And Roman Josi, he might be back full-time. And maybe he comes out again and has another career year like he did a couple of years ago. And then their goaltending, Saros. There's no way Saros can be that bad again. I think a team like Nashville has really good value in a lot of players because they're going to probably be drafted a little bit lower than they should be, and they'll probably have decent years again, right? So a guy like Stamkos, Marchessault, I mean, even Roman Josi. Josi's probably going to drop quite a bit, and I think he'll be a ton of value by the end of the year. I don't think Nashville has a very good schedule fantasy-wise, especially for the playoffs, but, I mean, you're trying to make the playoffs first, right? So if you're going to pick a guy up like Josi or Forsberg, it's not a bad thing at all. And maybe you'll make up for it with picking up guys from other teams that have good schedules. And then now on to my second riser, the Boston Bruins. They just have a pretty good team in general. And I know there's a lot of question marks up front. But Jeremy Swayman on the back end, he should have a good year. There's no reason he should have another year where he totally drops off. Their D-core is big and mean, and having Pasternak at the front end with Morgan Geekie, I think they actually have a way better team than what showed up last year. And they did lose Brad Marchand to the eventual Cup winners, but I don't think that's a huge loss for them. Obviously, Marchand was a great player and their captain, but I think it's time to give some of the young guys a little more of a leash. And I can see Boston coming back and having a really good year. And honestly, their schedule is pretty damn good. So they were definitely a team worth looking into. And I think it gives a guy like Pasternak a lot of value. I think Pasternak is going to be a huge grab this year if you can get him like 6th or 7th, because he's probably going to drop a little bit just because of how bad Boston was. But he's by far their best player, and he's actually one of the best wingers in the league. And he just gets a ton of shots. He gets lots of goals. He's going to get all the ice time, all the power play time, and he's generally a very healthy guy. I don't think he's missed much time. And then on to my final riser, I'm going with the New York Rangers. Shesterkin had a colossally horrible year, and he really shouldn't have been as bad as he was, but it was a rough year for all the Rangers, and they lost a couple guys too, right? And there was lots of drama surrounding the team. They were probably the second most drama-filled team right behind my Vancouver Canucks. And, they picked up JT Miller. Panarin is probably going to have a really good year again. A guy like Zibanejad, he's just one of those guys. It's like 1 year he's great, 1 year he's really bad. So maybe this year he's actually going to be good. And then Lafreniere, he should be popping off pretty soon. And I think they got a really good team, and their schedule is great, especially for the playoffs if you're week 21 to 23. So Rangers, I'd keep an eye out for most guys on the team that are the usual suspects. So just to recap, my top risers are Nashville, Boston, and New York Rangers. And I'd like to put honorable mention to Buffalo, but I didn't really want to choose them as my third team because I feel like every single year we all think Buffalo's going to finally step it up, and they find a way to disappoint. And the beginning of last season was one of the most disappointing starts to anybody's season ever. I don't want to say that and then find out, next month that was one of the worst takes I've ever had. And I'm just going to save myself some embarrassment and not talk about Buffalo. So let's move on to schedules. So I want to go over teams with lots of back-to-backs. I want to go over to teams with lots of off nights. And then I'm going to end it off with playoffs for weeks 21 to 23 and 22 to 24. So for back-to-backs, it's something you want to always keep in mind, especially when drafting goaltenders, because a team that plays a lot of back-to-backs, they're not going to be playing their starting goalies. So if you pick a team like LA, for example, they're tied for the most back-to-backs. They have 16 back-to-backs throughout the season. And then right there, you're assuming Kemper is probably not going to play a majority of those back-to-backs. So, that's 8 games guaranteed that he's not going to be playing. This is going to be the backup playing. We got LA, Montreal, the New York Islanders, Pittsburgh, and San Jose, and that's all 16 back-to-backs. That's a ton. So those are all guys I'd be worried about picking up starting goalies for, but maybe a tandem would be decent. The only team I would kind of think about is Montreal. I'm assuming Montembeault is just going to play every single game, and they're just gunning for playoffs. So Montembeault might be the safest pick out of all those guys. And honestly, all those teams are probably not the best teams to be picking goaltenders from anyways. I think LA is going for a regression. Montreal's on the up and up, so Montembeault, like I was saying, is probably the safest. I think the Islanders are just stuck in Loserville, and Sorokin is always a good choice, but maybe he just has a year like last year. And then Pittsburgh, who knows what's going on with Pittsburgh? They're probably a bottom dweller, and I feel like Sidney Crosby needs to be traded, but he won't be. And then San Jose, they're going to be gunning for McKenna this year anyways, so definitely avoid San Jose goalies. And then for the teams with the least amount of back-to-backs, unsurprisingly, it's going to be Winnipeg and Calgary. And I just say unsurprisingly for Winnipeg because Hellebuck's probably going to play almost every single game anyways. So, there's no back-to-backs there comparatively. And then Calgary, Dustin Wolf is their guy. So both those teams are going to be great pickups for goalies just because they're 2 goalies that are their top dogs, and they're 2 of the better goalies in the league anyways. So you're pretty safe to pick up either guy. And then going on with that, Anaheim and Utah, they both have 11. And both those teams too, right? So Dostal for Anaheim, he's going to be playing the majority of games anyways. So that's not very many back-to-backs. And then on Utah, it'll be Vejmelka again. And if Connor Ingram comes back, who knows what's really going on with him. But those are both teams where you can reliably get a ton of goalie starts and probably a good amount of goalie wins too with Utah. I think Utah is kind of going to be a playoff team this year. And then with Anaheim too, I think they're going to rise a little bit. So Dostal probably wouldn't be bad, especially in category leagues. He's going to face a lot of shots, and his save percentage is going to be pretty good, I'm assuming. So he's definitely worth a look. And then after that, you got a good chunk of teams like Chicago, Colorado, Dallas, Vegas, and they all have 12 back-to-backs. So after that point, you're pretty much not too worried about back-to-backs. It's more just the the teams with 16 and the teams with 9 or 11, that's more of a concern for you. And now let's move on to off nights. And here's another stat where Anaheim just is at the top. And Anaheim has 33 off nights. So in fantasy, that's huge. You don't want to really be picking a team that has no off nights. So this is where Nashville gets hit pretty hard too. They only have 15 off nights. And I wouldn't pick too many forwards on Nashville. If you're drafting a team, I definitely pick a guy like Forsberg. But if you already had Forsberg, I probably wouldn't pick up like Marchessault and Stamkos or Stamkos and O'Reilly. I mean, not a big deal to pick up like a forward, a D-man, and a goalie. So picking up Yossi, Forsberg, and Saros is probably a pretty good call because I think they're all going to be guys that are going to rise up. But I probably wouldn't draft, 3 or 4 forwards on the team, which isn't really a good strategy overall in fantasy hockey anyways. And then you look at a team like Anaheim and Utah, they have so many off nights where it's not a huge deal if you were to draft like Vetrano and then McTavish and maybe Leo Carlson you pick up, right? Because they're just playing so many off nights anyways. You're not too worried about screwing up your roster and then having one week where, you got too many guys on the same team and none of them can play because none of them have any games to play. Other good teams with lots of off nights are Utah, Chicago, St. Louis, and Washington. And they all have 31, 29, and 28 off nights. So those are other teams where I wouldn't be too concerned about picking a couple guys off of. I think of a team like St. Louis. You're definitely going to want to try to find Thomas and then maybe pick up Kyrou or Buchnevich. And then, a guy like Snuggerud, he might actually pop off. So there's a couple guys that you could pick up and not be too concerned about with, maxing out too many guys on a team. And then we'll go to the other end of the spectrum. So Nashville, like I said, and then Montreal and Dallas. And I think of Dallas specifically because they're kind of that team. They have a lot of good players and they kind of just roll through the lines a lot. So I'd have a tough time picking up a guy like, let's say you get Rantanen right off the bat, and then you pick up Jason Robertson and Rupe Hintz. Well, now they're not playing many off nights, so it's going to conflict a lot with a lot of other players on your team. So if you're picking up a guy from Dallas, maybe go Rantanen and then try to scoop up Harley and Ottinger, and then, you got a lot of guys from the same team, but they're all in different positions, so you're not too worried about them, ruining your weekly lineups. And then I'll go one other team is Boston with 17 off nights, so that's not very many. And then Edmonton, Minnesota, and Winnipeg at 18 off nights. And I wanted to focus more on those 3 teams because those are 3 teams that I think most of their players are going to get drafted pretty high. Obviously Edmonton, you got the those 3 guys there, McDavid, Draisaitl, Bouchard, and then you're never going to pick them together anyways. But after that, I don't know if you'd want to pick up too many guys from the same team in the first place. And then Minnesota, right? You might get Kaprizov, and then you're probably going to be able to snag a Boldy too. And then maybe you're looking at getting a Zuccarello. So maybe that's not the best decision either, just because they don't have many off nights. Okay, and then now let's just jump right into playoffs. I'm just going to go over the few teams that I think have the best schedule for weeks 21, 22, and 23. And a team that pops out right off the bat again is Anaheim. And it just seems like everything that I've gone over, right, back-to-backs, off nights, teams that could rise a little bit. Anaheim just always seems to be there. So Anaheim, they have one of the best schedules in the playoffs. So week 21, they play 3 games, and 2 of them are off nights, and that's actually pretty helpful. And then week 22, no off nights, 3 games. But then the final week of the playoffs for week 23, they play 4 games, but 3 of them are off nights. So you can really maximize your roster with Anaheim players. And then the next team with a really good schedule is Boston. So similar to Anaheim, they play 4 games from week 21 and then all the way to week 23. And then they play off nights in every single week. And then the week 22, they have 2 off nights. And they're one of the only teams that have multiple off nights. So if you're really trying to maximize your playoff schedule there, Boston and Anaheim would be 2 great teams to pick players off of because they both excel in the playoffs for different weeks. And then the next team after Boston would be Carolina, and they play 2 off nights in the first week and then 1 and 1 for weeks 22 and 23. And then Colorado is like a very good schedule. They have 3 off nights in week 21 and then 3 in week 23, and they have none in week 22. But they play 4, 3, and 4 for weeks 21, 22, and 23. And then after Colorado, the New Jersey Devils, they play a ton of off nights in week 21. And then the Rangers, I think they have the best overall schedule for the playoffs. So they have 2 off nights in week 21, 4 off nights, and so all 4 of the games they play in week 22. That's huge, right? And then for the final week, they have 1 off night, but they still play 4 games. The Philadelphia Flyers, I mean, their team's not great, but they have a pretty good schedule for the playoffs. So a guy like Konechny or Matvei Michkov, they both might be worth a pickup. And then Pittsburgh has a really good schedule too. They play 5 games. I think they're one of the only teams that play more than 4 games for the final week of the playoffs. So they're worth a look. And then after that, we have St. Louis. And St. Louis will be the final team that I say has the best schedule. So they play 4 off nights in week 23. It's worth looking into for all those teams. So I'll just go over it. Best schedules, I think: Anaheim, Boston, Carolina, Colorado, New Jersey Devils, New York Rangers, Philadelphia Flyers, Pittsburgh Penguins, and St. Louis Blues. And a couple other teams with a good schedule is Calgary, Detroit, Florida, Ottawa, Philadelphia, Toronto, Vancouver, and Washington. But I wouldn't really draft my team around picking up those playoff schedules. If I was really thinking about I was going to make the playoffs for sure, the first teams that I stated are definitely worth looking into, but these other teams that I just went over, they just have good schedules, so you don't need to prioritize picking up guys like that, but it's definitely worth looking into. And then if you were only drafting based on picking up guys that had really good schedules, teams that I'd avoid are Edmonton. Of course, don't avoid drafting McDavid or Draisaitl, but Edmonton, LA Kings, Minnesota Wild, Nashville, Seattle, San Jose, Utah, and Winnipeg, those are teams with really bad schedules for the playoffs there. So I would not draft guys from those teams if I was only thinking about playoffs, or even if you're, in the playoffs at that point and you're trying to maximize your roster for to get as many playoff games as you can. All those teams that I just said, they don't have great schedules, and maybe they're not playing many off nights, or maybe they're just not playing many nights in general. So I'm just going to do a quick recap of weeks 22 to 24 playoffs. I don't really want to focus on these playoffs too much because most leagues are running weeks 21 to 23. San Jose has the best schedule, and then, the majority of the league plays a ton of games anyways, so they don't really have a best or worst schedule. And then for the worst schedules, you'll want to avoid Buffalo, then Edmonton, Minnesota, New York Islanders, Toronto, Utah, Vegas, and Washington. So like I was saying earlier, you don't really need to avoid picking guys on those teams, but I probably wouldn't prioritize maxing out a bunch of players on the same team. So at the end of every show, I want to do what I'm going to call our Ice Picks, and that's obviously the name of the podcast too. And I went over at the beginning of the show what an Ice Pick is going to be. So an ice pick is going to be something that I think is like a good pickup for the week, or a team I think that's worth looking at, or something even maybe it's just a hot take and maybe it doesn't really make sense, but it's just something that I think is worth looking into. So for this first episode, I'm just going to do ice picks for teams that I really like this year. And I think my big team that I think's fallen under the radar is going to be the New York Rangers, and that's my ice pick. So I think if you're going to be drafting, I think it's probably pretty smart to be looking through the Rangers roster. And yeah, most of the guys on the team should be way better than they were, especially a guy like Panarin, Miller, Zibanejad, and maybe even Fox. Fox might even be kind of a dark horse D-man pickup. So if you can scoop a guy like that later, I think that'd be a really good value pick. So that's the end of the show. I just want to thank everybody for listening. I mean, I'm probably only going to get a couple listeners anyways, but if I can help you make a couple more informed decisions, or maybe just I showed you some things that you didn't really know about, right? Like maybe you never thought about back-to-backs and off nights, or maybe you were just not even thinking about the playoffs. So hopefully I just gave you a little bit of info that will help you out. Maybe it'll clear up some stuff you're thinking of for your upcoming draft. And yeah, so thanks for joining and listening, and I'm going to leave in the description my email. So it's going to be icepicksfantasyhockey@gmail.com. And if you have any comments or questions, I'd love to answer them. And maybe you have some ideas for the show that you'd like, or other info that you want to jump on and maybe, suggest, that'd be great. And I'll catch you next week for some more ice picks. Thanks, everyone.